Hi everybody, my name is Jason Stallings and welcome to the Artifice Podcast. And today we're going to do a bit of a music retrospective / review. And today we're going to talk about 13 songs by Fugazi. Well, sort of. Originally this was released as 2 EPs, which is this. And this. Yeah. So, Fugazi was probably one of the first punk bands outside of maybe The Clash that I ever got into. I first heard this band in college, back when there was a sort of music streaming kind of internal server of sorts that was being shared around in the dorm that I was living in at SCAD. And I first heard songs from this album and their first full-length album, Repeater. And this is by far probably the most accessible thing they've ever done, if you want to call it that. There's definitely, obviously, an attempt on this record to have more of a kind of commercial sound, or at least a mixture of like pop hooks, which is not something this band is really known for. And I think this is definitely one of the most interesting post-punk bands, probably the original post-punk band. And they put this album out in 1988 after Picciotto, sorry, I'm going to butcher that pronunciation, I think that's right, and Ian MacKaye dissolved their respective bands. Ian MacKaye came out of Minor Threats. Picciotto came out of a band called Rites of Spring, which is kind of considered the first emo band of sorts. Now, what's interesting about this is the first thing you'll hear on the first side of the first record is Waiting Room, which is probably their most famous song, even still. They have a few other somewhat well-known songs, but that one is the one that everybody's going to immediately know. Oh, that bass line. Yeah. So, what's interesting about this band? They are definitely passionate about what they express. Their lyrics can be either very abstract in nature or they can be very direct. They tend to lean more on the side of like abstract, but they make no mistake despite that. And the songs and the lyrics are a bit of a puzzle. And I'll read some lyrics here and there just to give you an idea of like how interesting the words in their songs are, which is interesting. Which is interesting because the vocals are maybe not everybody's cup of tea, but I like them. Ian MacKaye even kind of sounds like he's a Flintstone character in some of these songs, but it's a lot of fun. But this was never a band that was really aiming for a certain level of like clear pop success. If anything, they were sort of the antithesis of that. They never sold merch. They would actively avoid venues that promoted alcohol. I guess a little background: Ian MacKaye, his previous band started what has been since known as the straight edge movement, which is probably one of the more positive, or sort of positive, or at least that's the intent that started out, movements in the punk era, where when it came out in the late 70s, early 80s, up into the late 80s, that promoted good health, focusing on bettering yourself in your life, and kind of positive self-development and growth. Now, they came from the Washington, D.C. area, where bands like Bad Brains came from, and which is interesting because, like, they definitely had this DIY work ethic. They wouldn't do certain things, like music videos. They wouldn't sell merch. If you ever see a Fugazi shirt, it usually says this is not a Fugazi shirt. And like the band members even lived in like they wouldn't have air conditioning on. Like, they're vegans. They're very strict about their lifestyles. And which is surprising because like if you've ever been to DC, it's not always a place that is super hot or super cold or moderately temperatured. It can be very hot in the summer. So, that says a lot about their dedication. That because they were more or less running their own record label, which is Discord, which Ian started, they were able to really benefit from their own creations and their own financial gains long term over they definitely had long term sustainability in mind to a degree. I mean, you could argue that in a modern context, that wouldn't really work anymore, but they influenced other bands like Pearl Jam and or at least Eddie Vedder in the sense that they wanted to have their music accessible to all ages. They wanted to include people. They were definitely very pro a lot of progressive ideology and progressive movements. You can hear it in some of the songs here. The biggest example of that is going to be Suggestion, which was and is still probably to a degree one of the few songs that directly addresses a form of toxic masculinity, or at least the sort of poor behavior that can occur and is encouraged in certain circles of men. And to this day, it's still kind of a unique statement. And more or less, the idea was it was the narrator's call to men to act better and treat women better, in so many words. But there's kind of going through the songs. You have Bulldog Front, which listen to these on vinyl. That's a really good clear out, right up front. There's a lot more liveliness. There's a lot more energy. Everything breathes so much better. And these albums are pretty affordable for what they are, especially for reissues. And they don't always stay in print. So if you want to get them, highly suggested. And also they released the first kind of demos that they ever made that is a precursor to this album. Even though this is not necessarily their first album, so to speak, it's kind of been known as it is for a long time. Excuse me. So yeah, and also what this band does really well is a lot of stop-start dynamics, a lot of loud, quiet, loud, and really the dynamics of this band portray a band that is full of individuals who are really strong at their craft, but they all work to serve the song, and they communicate with each other really well. And I think that was something that, from what I understand, Ian was trying to look for coming out of Embrace and Minor Threat and some of the other bands he was in. So, you have, in songs like Badmouth and Wedding Room and Suggestion, they all have these really kind of funky bass lines. There's influences in this band that you wouldn't expect. They even said that Wedding Room was sort of came out of influence from reggae, which is a totally out of left field thing for a punk band to do, and it's really interesting. Their musical acumen was really cool, but what was also really interesting about them is they would go out of their way to tour anywhere and everywhere they could. They would play church gyms. They would play high school gyms. They would play open fields. They would, I think they even shut down a venue in Dallas once. And the fire marshal wouldn't allow the show to go until certain needs were met and all that. So it's interesting that, they on one hand would do certain things that they didn't believe in. They would not do those things to sort of maintain their ethics, but they would also go out of their way to promote themselves and be an underground band in other really weird ways. There's this famous picture of Guy hanging down from upside down from a basketball hoop screaming into the mic. It's a really cool picture, and it's like in some random gym. So yeah, like Burning is a really good example of like how tightly in sync they were. But there's other songs where they talk about, and this is where it gets interesting, because like I think they're talking about real specific issues that were pertinent at the time, especially in like the late 80s. Like Give Me the Cure, I'm pretty sure is a song about AIDS. And back then, that was a really terrifying thing that wasn't even being talked about yet. And it really wouldn't get resolved for decades. But they talked about it in such harrowing detail. And even if it's not specifically about that, it is about the fear of like losing your life from a medical situation. And I think if anything, it's a much more pertinent subject than it was back then, just because the debate over healthcare is such a hotly debated, contested thing. Yeah, and there's other songs that really touch on probably their views on things like drug addiction, like Glue Man. I'm pretty sure is about kind of having this very negative view of somebody who is, struggling with drug addiction. And okay, yeah, the sun comes up, the tide rolls out, the trucks roll by, and the park is still a park where children play and pick up stones, anything to make them feel less alone. He's alone. His mind is his own town where his thoughts run aground. They fall over up and down. I spend it all on the bag, on the drag. So, yeah, I mean, they kind of roll up a little bit different when you just read them, but the way they're sung, every word has intentional, like, anger behind it or some kind of, like, expression. And sometimes that expression is a little hard to understand, but that's, where the band is sort of a master of, like, vacillating between abstraction and non-abstraction. Anyway, on to the next side, or next EP, with Margin Walker. Now, I would say this, the first half of this record, or set of EPs, is probably musically the strongest. And, it's probably a part of the reason why it got broken out into two EPs. They are somewhat distinct from each other when you listen to them like that. And, when you listen to 13 songs like on streaming, you don't necessarily think about that because it is almost this kind of sprawling, it seems like a sprawling double album of sorts, but it isn't. It's sort of like almost too long to be an album, but almost too short to be a double album. And yeah, you get the really interesting explorations of things like races on a song and the same. And yes, I know this is politically correct, but it comes to you spiritually direct to attempt to thoughtfully affect your way of thinking. That is, if you believe in race or that you were born in the right time or place, this is a thought about face, your way of thinking. And the same could be said for all those people lying dead. For them to die was a distraction. I mean, this is pretty intense stuff. And yeah, like later on it talks about like, the need to own a gun, which I think is really interesting. And, having grown up in Texas, this hits me a little differently. I mean, it probably was viewed a certain way in DC too. Yeah, I mean, there's something about like this insecure need to own a gun. So, kind of repeats that same general idea. And then you get songs like, Burning 2, Provisional. Like they tackle subjects in a very abstract manner. Again, things like poverty, gentrification. And these are things that you really have to read into the lyrics and then go back and listen to it and think, oh wow, that's kind of hits a little bit differently. And that's kind of a cool thing about this band, is that they are willing to rein in what they're saying and again go back to serve the music. But if you like a lot of hardcore bands are like this, like Bad Brains too. If you but I guess the difference is like Minor Threat was super direct about what they were saying. Most of it was just Ian shouting into a mic saying, "Don't have sex, don't do drugs, blah blah blah." Anger, anger, anger. Whereas this is a little more measured and considered. And one of the songs that is most interesting to me, that I sort of had the wrong assumption about, that I think about differently now as I'm reading the lyrics, is Promises. I always thought that was kind of related to kind of calling out politicians who don't own up on their promises, things like that. But it seems to be more about kind of this idea of like two people making promises to each other that they can't own up to. And sometimes the unpredictability of life just forces that. And that to me is a really interesting kind of exploration of like there's this exploration of like dynamics and relationships and things like that in this record, and they're not super specific about any person that I know of. I mean, I know there is a podcast about Fugazi that you can look up where each episode is an exploration of the meaning behind the song. It's super interesting stuff. Like the one that really took me by surprise is like Foreman's Dog. And that's on another record and hits. We'll talk about that another time. So, yeah, I mean, like Margin Walker is an interesting one because this band isn't above doing things that like classic rock bands where they're just having a direct narrative with the listener. And that is interesting because it's sort of a lost art. It's sort of this abstract relationship you have with the artist and the audience. So it's cool that they're willing to do something like that. That is a little more on the traditional side, sort of. Anywho, I think this band is really interesting. Their handling of time signatures is really cool. It's like, especially later on in, what song was it? Yeah, Promises. Like, there's sort of these really interesting, like, atmospheric passages that happen in songs. And because the songs are so direct and jarring, unless you're sitting down, listening to it, or especially in vinyl, you might miss out on these little moments. They're really cool. Anyway, yeah, Fugazi is one of my favorite bands. There are other albums like Enter the Kill Checker that are good. A little bit of a rough listen, just because this band definitely pushed, against their tendency to try to be commercial musically. But it led to a pretty long career. They folded in, I think, 2001. 9/11 happened. That they put out their last record, The Argument, which is fantastic. You definitely saw some musical like development, progression, evolution, maturity, and they kind of stayed the same kind of guys they were from beginning to end, but they grew as musicians and artists and evolved their sound and what they were saying, and kind of stayed true to themselves. What I think that would work in this modern day and age with the cost of living, the way things work now, especially in the music business. It's hard to say. I know that they've definitely gotten lots of offers. My guess is they probably all got families and decided that was important. I can't blame them. Anyway, thank you for watching. Catch some other reviews coming up soon. And if you want to check out my art, please visit jason-stallings.com. And I'll see you soon.